MetricNet and its predecessor companies have now completed more than 3,000 service and support benchmarks. We have a global benchmarking database that covers more than 60 countries worldwide, and we track more than 70 key performance indicators, everything from customer satisfaction and first call resolution rate in the service desk to mean time to resolve and cost per ticket in desktop support. We have also cataloged and defined more than 120 industry best practices. These have been observed empirically from the benchmarks that we have done. We simply ask ourselves, when we complete a benchmark from an organization that is achieving high levels of performance and consistently exceeding customer expectations, we ask ourselves, what do they have in common? What do these companies that perform well have in common with each other in the area of strategy, support strategy that is, human resource management, in the area of ticket handling processes and procedures, in the area of technology, in the area of performance measurement and management, and finally in stakeholder communication. And we've identified 120 industry best practices that are common to those organizations that perform extraordinarily well in IT service and support. So we've created a taxonomy of those industry best practices, and whenever we conduct a benchmark, we bounce those best practices up against the organization we're benchmarking in an effort to identify how mature those organizations are in each of those 6 categories that I just mentioned. Now, the benchmarking results I'm going to be sharing with you today come from 19 separate countries. These are for the first 3 quarters of 2015. You can see that, of course, North America is represented here. We got Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. We've got some countries in Latin America, both Central America and South America. We've got a number of companies in Asia, Southeast Asia, represented here. These are service and support organizations. Some of them are outsourced. Some of them are managed internally. And then, as you can see, throughout Western and Central Europe, we have a number of companies and service and support organizations represented. So this is really a global look-see at what's going on in 2015 with key performance indicators around IT service and support. Now, most of you are probably familiar with benchmarking. You may have done benchmarking in the past, or you at least understand how it works. But let me give you a real quick sort of a refresher on the benchmarking methodology that MetricNet uses when we conduct these benchmarks. Benchmarking begins with a comparison. That is, you compare your service and support performance to that of a peer group. So we're comparing things like cost per ticket, customer satisfaction, mean time to resolve, first call resolution rate, speed of answer, call abandonment rate. We look at a whole host of metrics, and we compare the organizations that benchmark with MetricNet to a comparable peer group. It's very critical to recognize that peer group selection is perhaps the single most important success factor in benchmarking, because you have to have comparability in scope of services offered, scale, meaning number of tickets, complexity, and geography. These are labor-intensive functions. They are largely driven by wage rates, and so when you're benchmarking, if you're a North American company, say U.S. or Canada, you probably don't want to benchmark against the company in the Philippines or India. The wage rates are very different, and you're not going to get a fair cost comparison. So the comparison has to be done in a valid way on a level playing field, what we call an apples-to-apples comparison. And the 4 dimensions, again, are scope and scale, complexity, and geography. Once we have those common and comparable, then we've got a level playing field. And we can identify performance gaps. The key thing, though, is when we identify a performance gap, we need to explain why that gap exists. If there is a cost gap, meaning your costs are too high, or a quality gap, customer satisfaction is on the low side, or a cycle time gap, Dick mentioned earlier, better, faster, cheaper, those are the 3 dimensions of competition. Better means higher quality, faster means quicker cycle times, cheaper means lower cost per ticket. Those are the primary dimensions of competition. And in benchmarking, those are the primary things we look at. We look at cost, we look at quality, we look at cycle time. And if you identify a performance gap, it's critical to be able to explain that gap, because unless you can diagnose why a gap exists, you probably can't do anything about it. Now, the real beauty of benchmarking is this. Most improvement efforts take place incrementally through trial and error. So it takes a long time to achieve world-class performance if an organization ever even gets to world-class performance. Benchmarking is the quickest way to short-circuit that process, because it says you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to improve incrementally through trial and error. The best practices are pretty well understood, and they're pretty well documented at this point, and you can build on those industry best practices and achieve world-class performance, not at an evolutionary pace, but rather at a revolutionary pace. That's the real value of benchmarking, is that it starts with measurement, goes to comparison, then diagnosis, and then finally, adoption. You adopt the industry's best practices so that you can achieve the same level of performance that the best performers in your industry have been able to achieve. Now, the goal of benchmarking, I mentioned better, faster, cheaper. Two of those dimensions are shown here. It's funny that that echoes what Dick said earlier. You can pick two of the three. Well, benchmarking is all about helping you become more efficient, meaning better cost efficiency, and more effective, meaning higher customer satisfaction. If we take a random set of data points, the blue circles that you see here, and we put them on a two-dimensional chart with cost per ticket on the x-axis and customer satisfaction or quality on the y-axis, we get a locus of points that looks like this. Now, you'll notice several things about this chart. The first is that there's an obvious correlation between cost and quality. That's not only a correlation, it is a cause and effect relationship. The reason we put cost on the x-axis is because you may remember from high school algebra that cost is, or the x-axis I should say, is the independent variable. Quality, or the y-axis, is the dependent variable. 99.9% of the organizations we work with are cost-driven, meaning that they are given a budget and they're told to do the best they can with that budget. Very rarely do we see situations where an organization is given quality objectives and then told, we'll give you the money that you need to achieve that quality. No, that just almost never happens. So typically there's negotiation around budget, which turns into cost per ticket, which ultimately drives your quality. What benchmarking does for an organization is it moves you in both dimensions. It moves the needle on both axes. So if we put the data points on here, you can see they are bounded on the bottom by what we call the average performance curve. They're bounded on the top by the best-in-class performance curve. This is really a below-average performance curve, but we're being a little bit gratuitous, and we're calling it the average performance curve. Benchmarking is designed to help you identify opportunities to become more efficient, that is, reduce your costs, take bad costs out of the system, and at the same time improve the quality of service. So better, faster, cheaper is what benchmarking is all about. Once you operate on this upper curve, you have been optimized, which means that if you want to see an improvement in quality, you are going to, of necessity, see higher costs. Conversely, if you cut your costs when you're on this optimized curve, you will see a reduction in the quality of service that you deliver. So cost and quality are absolutely correlated. That shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. But if you are not yet optimized, which most service and support organizations are not, there is a significant opportunity through benchmarking to reduce your cost and improve your quality simultaneously. So better, faster, cheaper. There is a free lunch. Not in the thermodynamics sense. Second law of thermodynamics is not going to be violated. But when it comes to processes, typically they are not optimized. What benchmarking does enable an organization to do is optimize and become better, faster, cheaper, move from some average level of performance to this optimum level of performance. Now, the key performance indicators we use for our desktop support benchmark is shown here on page 8. You can see that we organize these metrics into 7 categories. We've got cost metrics, quality metrics, ticket handling metrics, service level, technician, productivity, and workload metrics. We're oftentimes asked why we look at so many key performance indicators in a benchmark, and the answer is because we need to provide a diagnostic benchmark. It's not good enough to just say, hey, your costs are high and your quality is low, but I'm not quite sure why. If cost is high, there are usually 3 or 4 reasons why the cost might be high. If customer satisfaction is low, same thing, 3 or 4 reasons why it might be low. But we need to have the data in order to drill down to the underlying drivers of those performance gaps in order to explain those performance gaps. Once you can explain a performance gap, you can do something about it. So benchmarking is not just a comparative exercise. Let's compare our cost, our quality, our cycle time. It is a diagnostic exercise that says, okay, now that we've done the comparison, let's figure out what it is that's driving these gaps, positive or negative, because we want to perpetuate the positive performance and we want to take steps to mitigate or eliminate the negative performance. That is what good benchmarking is all about. Measure, compare, diagnose, and then optimize. Measure, compare, diagnose, and act. Those 4 elements are the key success factors in benchmarking. Now, we make a distinction between incidents and service requests when it comes to desktop support. If you add the 2, an incident plus service request volume is your total ticket volume. So incidents and service requests are a subset of total tickets. Incidents are generally unplanned work, things like hardware break fix and device failure. Service requests, by contrast, are typically planned work. Now, the work time on an incident is typically less than the work time on a service request. I'm not talking about cycle time now. Cycle time would be we open the ticket at 8 in the morning, close it at 4 in the afternoon. The mean time to resolve is 8 hours. But you might have only worked on the ticket for 10 minutes. When we talk about work time, we're talking about the actual amount of time worked on a ticket. Generally, incidents require less work time than service requests do, but service requests are typically planned work. Things like physical moves, adds, and changes, hardware, software upgrades, device refreshes, and the like. And so when we get into the metrics, you are going to see things like cost per incident, cost per service request, and it was important for me to make the distinction between the two before we get into that. Let's talk about the service desk metrics, and then I'm going to be showing you some data in a few minutes here. Our service desk metrics, 6 categories: cost, quality, productivity, agent metrics, service level metrics, and call handling metrics. They largely mirror each other, that is the desktop support metrics and the service desk metrics. They typically have counterparts. So cost per contact for the service desk has cost per ticket in desktop support. Things like contacts per agent per month on the service desk, what we have is tickets per technician per month in desktop support. So a lot of the metrics have mirror images in the desktop support benchmark, but there are approximately 25 key performance indicators on this page. And once again, this gives us a 360-degree view of the service desk that we are benchmarking and enables us not only to find performance gaps, but also to diagnose the underlying drivers of those performance gaps. Once you've diagnosed those, you can identify and prescribe actions that will enable an organization to eliminate the negative performance gaps, or at least mitigate them, and then perpetuate the positive performance gaps. I'm about to show you some data, but I do want to give you a big caveat, kind of a big footnote before I show you the data. And the footnote is this. I've already alluded to it. If you look at these 4 words over here, scope, scale, complexity, and geography, these are the 4 criteria that need to be common, set common, if you will, between an organization and a benchmarking peer group. In other words, when you benchmark your performance against that of a peer group, that peer group needs to have a similar scope of services, a similar scale, because these are scale-sensitive functions, similar complexity, and a similar geography. Let me give you an example here. Let's say we have a service desk that's providing Microsoft Office support, and that's all they do. Typical handle time in that environment is going to be about 5 or 6 minutes. By contrast, if we have a service desk that's providing support for complex business applications in Oracle or C# or some other language, those handle times run 20, 25, maybe even 30 minutes. You don't want to be comparing a Microsoft Office service desk to a service desk that supports complex business applications. It simply is not a valid comparison. Likewise, on scale, every time you double your ticket volume, you expect to see a reduction in cost of approximately 5%. So if you go from 2,000 to 4,000 tickets per month, you should expect to see a reduction in cost due to the economies of scale. Complexity can be measured by work time in desktop support and by handle time in the service desk. They're pretty good proxies for complexity. The longer the handle time, typically, the more the complexity of the contact or the ticket. And then geography I already mentioned, because these are labor-intensive functions. You want to be benchmarking against organizations that operate in a similar geography to your own. Now, these are just sample companies are arrayed around the edge here. I'm not making a suggestion one way or the other about their benchmarks, but what I am suggesting is that the data that I'm about to show you, you need to be cautious about comparing your own performance to, because this represents kind of a global average for the 19 countries that were in this benchmark. We're starting here on page 12 with the desktop support benchmarking summary. You can see in the left-hand column what we have is the metric category. I showed you that back here, 7 categories of metrics. 7 categories of metrics. Here are the key performance indicators, second column from the left. There's almost 30 of them. Then the worldwide average for all of the companies that have participated in benchmarks in 2015 with MetricNet. We have the arithmetic minimum, we have the arithmetic maximum, and then we have the median, meaning half the data points are above, half the data points are below. It's kind of the midpoint. Now, the median and the average will be the same if you get a symmetrical distribution, but symmetrical distributions don't happen very often in the real world. In fact, they almost never happen. And so the median typically is going to be something different than the average, and it tells you a little bit something about the skewness. You can see that the median here is not too far away from the average on cost per ticket. The reason it's an asymmetrical distribution is because it's got a long tail on the right-hand side. You can see here that the average cost per ticket is $66.60, but look at the maximum cost per ticket at $176. That tells you that it's got a long tail on the right-hand side. If we go down here to quality metrics, customer satisfaction, worldwide the average customer satisfaction is 84.6%, but it ranges from a low of 54.6% to a high of almost 99%, 98.3%. So once again, it's not a symmetrical distribution. It's got a long tail on the left-hand side, actually, in this particular case, you can see that there's more data points to the left of the average than there are to the right of the average. So once again, we get some skewness in the distribution here, and the median is not the same as the average.